Imperialism. Imperialism is a state policy, practice, or advocacy of extending power and dominion, especially by direct territorial acquisition or by gaining political and economic control of the other areas. Because it always involves the use of power, whether military force or some subtler form, imperialism has often been considered morally reprehensible, and the term is frequently employed in the international propaganda to denounce and indiscredit an opponent's foreign policy. The first example of imperialism is Africa. As the world approached to the 20th century, several powers grew desperate for more land and more control. In the 1870s, the Belgian King Leopold sent emissaries to establish trade with native Africans in the Congo. This single act began a flurry of imperialistic activities at the other nations of Europe, including France, Great Britain, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. This immediate fight for the lands is known as the Scramble of Africa. Between 1450 and 1750, Europeans traded with Africa, but they set up very few colonies. By 1850, only a few colonies existed along African coastlines, such as Algeria, conquered by the French, the Cape Colony, conquered by Great Britain, and Angola, conquered by Portugal. Instead, free African states continued. And after the end of the slave trade in 1800s, a lively exchange took place between Europeans and African states, such as the Sokotoko Caliphate in Western Africa and Egypt and Ethiopia in North Africa. They traded manufactured goods of gold, ivory, and palm oil. Under the leadership of Muhammad Ali and his grandson Ismaili, Egypt grew to be the strongest Muslim state of the 19th century, producing cotton for export and employing Western technology and business methods. They benefited from the American Civil War, when cotton shipments from the southern U.S. were cut off, but the Egyptian cotton market collapsed after American shipments resumed after the Civil War was over. In the later half of the 19th century, dramatic changes occurred as Europeans began to explore Africa's interior, and by the 1940s, virtually entire the continent was colonized by one or the other of the competitive European countries. European imperialists built on the information provided by adventurers or missionaries, especially the famous Dr. David Livingstone and Henry Stanley. Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, went to Africa in the 1840s and spent 3 decades exploring the interior of Africa and setting up missionary outposts all the way from Central Africa to Cape Colony on the southern trip. When people in Britain lost contact with Livingstone, journalist Harry Stanley became a new sensation when he traveled to Africa and found Livingstone. The two speak interest in Africa, and others followed, including the imperialists. The Berlin Conference in 1884, in an effort to avoid war, allowed European diplomats to draw lines and maps and carve Africa into colonies. The result was a transformation of political and economic Africa, with virtually all parts of the continent colonized by 1900s. As European powers continued to invade and interfere with African land and culture, several of the Africans became extremely frustrated and upset. Various individuals began to lead independence movements and inspired several others to join the fight of freedom. Another example of imperialism is imperialism in Asia. Imperialism in Asia traces its roots back to the late 15th century, with a series of trips through a sea pass to India, in the hope of establishing direct trade between Europe and Asia in species. Before 1500, European economies were largely self-sufficient, only supplemented by minor trade with Asia and Africa. Within the next century, however, European and Asian economies were slowly becoming integrated through the rise of new global trade routes, and the early thrust of European political power, commerce, and culture in Asia gave its rise to the growing trade in lucrative commodities. In the 16th century, the Portuguese broke the monopoly of the Arabs and Italians of the trade between Asia and Europe by the discovery of the sea routes to India around the Cape of Good Hope. However, with the rise of the rival Dutch East India Company, Portuguese influence in Asia was gradually eclipsed. Dutch forces first established independent bases in the east, and then between 1640s and 1660s, wrestled Malacca, Ceylon, some southern India spots, and the lucrative Japan trade from the Portuguese. Later, the English and the French established settlements in India and established a trade with China, and their own acquisition gradually surpassed those of Dutch. Following the end of the Seven Years' War in 1763, the British eliminated French influence in India and established the British East India Company as the most important political force in India's subcontinent. Before the Industrial Revolution in mid to late 19th century, the demand of Oriental goods remained the driving force behind European imperialism, and the European stake in Asia remained confident largely to trading stations and strategic outposts necessary to protect trade. Industrialization, however, dramatically increased European demand of Asian raw materials, and the sharp long depression of 1870s provoked a scramble for new markets of European industrial products and financial services in Africa, the Americas, Eastern Europe, and especially in Asia. This scramble coincided with a new era in global colonial expansion known as the New Imperialism, which saw a shift in the focus from the trade in direct rule to formal colonial control or vast overseas territories ruled as political extensions of their mother countries. Between the 1870s and the beginning of the World War I in 1940, the United Kingdom, France, and Netherlands added to their empires vast expanses of territory in the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. In the same period, the Empire of Japan following the Meiji Restoration, the German Empire following the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, Tsarist Russia, and the United States following the Spanish-American War in 1898 quickly emerged as new imperialism powers in Asia and the Pacific Ocean area. But in conclusion, imperialism is bad or good? In my personal opinion, I think it brought changes. Some of them are positive and some of them are negative. One reason why I consider imperialism bad is because it started racism, the idea that one race is better than another. Africa and Asia were weak, less powerful nations, so that people that occupied the lands were seen as the lower than the more powerful European coming in with their big weapons and superiority. Also, another thing that imperialism did is cause conflict and rivalries between countries trying to gain control of the areas full of the most resources and therefore profit of them. It also caused big problems with the natives to the land who were getting taken over. They had no control of their homeland. There was also the Boer War. The war was between the British and the Boers. Britain won and forced the Boer republics to join the Union of South Africa, a controlled nation. Another reason is because, with the new people going to different places, the spread of diseases was very high. Europeans were most susceptible to malaria, and Africans were probably more susceptible to diseases of Europe, just as Europeans killed of Native Americans in America. The same thing probably happened in many places in the world. I dislike the idea of imperialism, but I need to accept that it also brought some good changes, like the exchange of cultures and costumes, also the language, and in some cities the urbanization. So in conclusion, imperialism isn't bad or isn't good. It depends on the point of view of the people.